My name's Hugh. I'm one of the leaders here at Grace City, and it's great to be with you this morning. How are we? Excellent. I like the positive outlook. So I just want to add my welcome to the welcomes you've already been given. It's always great to see you here, especially if you're visiting for the first time. I hope that you feel at home with us and comfortable with us. And a special warm welcome if you wouldn't necessarily call yourself a Christian, but you're just here checking it out. You know, we are so pleased to have you with us. And I hope you can appreciate and engage at least some of what's going on. And I hope some of what I say is relevant to you. I just wanted to fill you in kind of before I start preaching. Yesterday, we had what's called the Alpha Holy Spirit Day. So as a church, we've been running a course called Alpha. And we had a few people on that course, which is great. And in particular, there's two individuals, a couple who are not Christians. And they did the previous Alpha course, and they did it again. They're doing it again this year. And it was just so amazing. We did this moment where we say, hey, if you want someone to pray for you to receive the Holy Spirit and encounter God. If you're happy for that, no pressure at all. You have to just kind of raise your hands. And then both of them did, not Christians, but they were happy. So we were able to come and pray for them. And the people who were praying for them were crying profusely, and there was a lot of tissues. They themselves seemed a bit shocked at what was going on. I don't know what happened internally, externally, there wasn't much, but I just believe God is so at work in their heart. And it's a journey, people on a journey of discovering God. And I'm just so pleased that as a church, we're helping people in that journey. So please do keep praying for us. We've got 2 weeks left, but it doesn't matter when the course ends, really. We're just going to keep those relationships because we love people. But what are we here to speak about today? Well, let me start with a question. I reckon we all have bad days. And let's say your Wednesday was bad. When you get home, what's your kind of the thing that you would just think, oh, I just need that? For me, not maybe need is a strong word, but it'd be like my mind would go to ice cream or dark chocolate, or I would combine those two things. Do you know what? If you have a hard day, it's just like, I just need this to tide me over. Can anyone relate to either of those two? Or for you, it could be wine? Wine, okay. We've got a few yesterday here. Okay. Your convenient space to be prayed for. You're right at the front. You're too enthusiastic. No, totally fine. For others, it could be perhaps seeing friends. No one's going for that. Okay. Online shopping, maybe, perhaps buying a few things. I don't know what it could be. Different things for different people. But the truth is, we all have difficult days. And one thing I've heard a lot from people who wouldn't call themselves Christians is that they think that Christianity is a bit of a crutch. That when you have difficult times, difficult moments in life, you turn to something like faith. And they say, I've had people say to me, faith is for weak people who can't cope with life. It's your way of getting through life. And if you're here, you wouldn't call yourself a Christian. Maybe you've kind of thought that kind of thing before. Maybe you think, oh yeah, I could agree with that. If you're here as a Christian, what do you think of that statement? Do you think it's true? Do you think it's not true? Do you think Christianity is a crutch? I kind of think, well, to be honest, it is a bit of a crutch. To be honest, I kind of agree. Like, when I'm going through difficult times, I find it incredibly helpful that I've got this God I can turn to with absolutely anything that's going on, and he can change it and make it better. That's a huge, really awesome crutch. So the answer is, well, actually, I'm a weak person. I need a crutch. That's the truth. But at the same time, I think actually being a Christian sometimes, rather than avoiding difficulties, it seems to create more challenges than I had before. Do you know what I mean? It makes life a little bit more difficult. Maybe if you just getting to church this morning was such a struggle, dude, if I wasn't a Christian, I could just be still in bed or doing whatever I want to do. Now I'm in church, such an effort to get here. This is the lamest crutch ever because it makes my life more complicated. So I think kind of both are true. Actually, being a Christian makes life a little bit more difficult at times, but it's a huge source of support. And that's kind of the topic that we're looking at this morning. We're continuing our series on Hebrews. And it's kind of like investigating how we view suffering and how we explore it. Actually, it helps us change our perspective and see it not in the light of just what's going on, but in the light of something eternal. But it also kind of lines us up to expect life to be a little bit more difficult for us because of our faith. So why don't I pray and then we'll get into it. God, we just want to say that we just love your word so much. it's like the plumb line of our life. It's the whole thing that we build our life upon. But I thank you it's so much more than a book. That it's living and active, sharper than a double-edged sword, Lord God. It cuts to the core of our hearts and our souls. And more than that, it feeds us the truth of your incredible love. It shows us the way, Lord God. And I thank you, Lord God, Holy Spirit, that you're our teacher. When Jesus was filled with the Holy Spirit, he went out to teach. I pray, Holy Spirit, you'd inspire me. And I just pray your presence would just be in this room, that you'd be teaching people, that you'd be personally bringing revelations to people. And we, as a people, want to have open hearts to hear from you this morning. So just be with us in Jesus' name. Amen. So I'm preaching from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 to 17. And the kind of context really for the book of Hebrews is a people who are suffering. We don't know exactly who they were, and we don't know exactly what was going on, but we can kind of get a feel. So Hebrews 10 tells us that this group of Christians, they had been... They'd received insults for their faith. They'd been physically assaulted for their faith. They'd been publicly disgraced for their faith. They'd been put in prison for their faith. And even some of them had faced the confiscation of their property for their faith. So just imagine that. To turn up to church, Miles and Kate risk the prospect of going home and not having a home anymore because somebody has confiscated it. Or the fact that someone in your city group, because they're going to church, is now actually in prison. And you're going to choose whether you're going to distance yourself from them as if you never knew them, because that would be easier, or whether you're actually going to be solid and go and support them in their faith. They're a group of people facing real persecution. They're like a marginalized people group, publicly shamed, who face career suicide for admitting that they're Christians. And initially, they faced up pretty well. They did a good job, and they were strong, and they were fervent. But as time went on, we get the feeling that kind of waned, and they kind of weakened a little bit, and their enthusiasm died off a little bit. So the whole book of Hebrews is trying to shake them back into that initial enthusiasm. It's say, hey, don't compromise. You're not the ones who shrink. Don't shrink back. Don't drift away, but keep firm in your race. And I think that's a really helpful context for us to remind ourselves as we read these verses. So I'm going to read these verses a little bit at a time and just unpack them as we go. So I'll read the first 3 verses. It will appear on the screen behind you. Or if I'm blocking your view, you can just read in your own Bible or listen along. Verses 1 to 3. It says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. So last week we looked at Hebrews chapter 11 together, which is like the heroes of the faith, right? These are the ones who went before us who were just epic, heroic. And I kind of picture myself walking down a kind of long, very nice corridor with all these portraits of these amazing heroes of faith. And I see almost like a tour guide saying, hey, this is so-and-so and they did this, and this is so-and-so and they did that. And this is like my family. This is my heritage. Wow, they're such kind of great heroes of faith. But then as chapter 12 comes in, the scene switches from me looking at heroes to now actually me being center stage. And there's this atmosphere of this amphitheater created with this great cloud of witnesses. The Romans loved their games. They packed their amphitheaters. There was thousands and thousands of people in there, and their games would go on for days. And it's that's the kind of stage that's set. And these were extremely passionate occasions. One of the major issues at these kind of these gladiatorial games, was riots. If the guy you were backing lost, actually there was always a risk of riots because people were extremely excited. It's like Middle Eastern kind of fire. So there's this great cloud of witnesses, and you're at the center stage. The verse says that that you've got a race marked out for you, that you've got a race to run. It's not just about the heroes of faith. You've got your own lane to run. And these witnesses are onlookers, but they're witnesses in the sense, what do witnesses do? They testify. They testify in court. They say, hey, this was true for me. They testify that actually there was obstacles and hurdles and difficulties in my life, but I was able to cling on, and I can testify that God is faithful, that he never let me down. He will always bring you through. They testify to that. But we don't just look to them and their testimonies, we look at the story of Jesus. It says, fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. He's the author in the sense that he wrote the book. He's the one who went first. He's the one who trailblazed the way for us and made it possible to follow. And he's the perfecter in the sense that he did it perfectly. He never made a mistake. He never waned. He never drifted. The whole time, his faith was absolutely perfect. And we're to kind of emulate him and also follow in his footsteps. But then it goes on to say, well, what kind of lane did Jesus run in? And therefore, what kind of lane can I expect to run in? To be honest, it was one of great suffering. The suffering of the cross. And he said he endured the suffering of the cross. And he considered the shame of the cross. Actually, it was the most shameful death ever created, to be publicly crucified. No Roman would ever be crucified because it's just that too shameful for them. This is for the lowest of the low. Jesus considered that shame and almost scoffed at it. And he thought, I will embrace that shame because he fixed his eyes on something so much greater. And so actually, that's the kind of lane that we've signed up to run in. That's the kind of race that we've signed up to run in. He's the one who went first. Well, we're following him behind him, and we've got to expect a little bit of suffering. But it's not like Tough Mudder, where you have these big challenges, but if it's really difficult, you can actually just walk around. That's not available to us. We've got to go head on, straight through, right through life. This would have been comforting for the Hebrews in some sense, because actually, I think it helps them see what's going on. This is a community that's facing persecution and suffering, saying, hey, but you're not the first, and God was faithful to everyone who went before, and he will be to you. And I think it's encouraging for us, because for me, it helps us zoom out on the immediate kind of challenges that I'm facing and see them in the context of something eternal. I'm running a race here. I've been given a lane by God, and although what I'm going through right now may be difficult and challenging, actually, to drift away, to veer out of my lane would be detrimental, but I can kind of fix my eyes on my goal, and I can keep going and going and going. And in a room this big, they say, there'd probably be 25% of people who are pretty happy with life right now. And, I don't know why, but maybe you just got a promotion, maybe you're just about to go on holiday, maybe you are on holiday, you're feeling pretty good. 50% maybe just a little bit average, just a little bit run-of-the-mill, it's okay, but not awesome. You're looking forward to Christmas, a bit of a break. And then there'd be another 25% that actually is facing a really difficult point in time. Maybe life's just really hard at the moment. And a portion of that 25% would be facing some of the most difficult things that they've ever faced before. So we're, as a community, in a very different place, in a very different space. But the truth is, we'll all go through these challenges, even if we're not facing them right now. I was at youth on Friday. We have a youth group called 180 Youth, and Jordan Stoddard did this thing while he was preaching, and he's actually a fantastic preacher, and I'm just going to copy what he did, and I told him that I would credit his work, let you know that it was his idea. But he said, think of something that you're going through right now in your life. You can do this, right? So think of something, whatever it may be, big or small, think of it. Have you got something? Do you need more time? I'm not seeing very many nods. Have you got something? Yeah, we definitely got some things. Okay. He said, okay, that's a real issue and it's a challenge. He said, in 24 hours' time, will it still be difficult? Most of you will probably say yes, but not all of you actually. In a week's time, will you still be facing that challenge? Will you have got that assignment in by now? Will that kid who's sick, will they be healthier now? Maybe yes, maybe no. In a month's time, will it still be there? In a year's time, will it still be there? And then he asked the question, in 10,000 years' time, will it still be there? And Hudson Lear put his hand up and said, no, we'll all be dead. It's true. And Jordan said, well, that's exactly the point. Actually, what we're going through now, we won't be going through forever. It will have an end. But the truth is, how we go through it now echoes right into eternity. That does count. So we want to run our race. We want to run our lane and not waver, understanding the eternal consequences of every decision that we make. And we want to throw off the stuff that hinders us, that burdens us, that's not necessary, and the sin that so easily entangles so that we can keep pushing on with our journey. And moving on then from verse 4 to verse 11. It says, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Have you completely forgotten this word of encouragement that addresses you as a father addresses his son? It says, my son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastens everyone he accepts as his son. Endure hardship as discipline. God is treating you as his children. For what children are not disciplined by their father? If you're not disciplined, and everyone undergoes discipline, then you are not legitimate, not true sons and daughters at all. Moreover, we all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. So essentially, what he's saying is that God disciplines the ones that he loves. Don't lose heart when he does that, actually. It's a sign that you are legitimate children. So he says, endure hardship as disciplines. And this was really important for the Hebrews because they were going through hardship, and it's important for us. I think when you're going through hard times, that's the time you're most tempted to say, where is God? Where is he? Is he forsaken me? Has he forgotten me? Maybe he's just focusing so much over there that he's not over here right now. Actually, this passage teaches quite the opposite. It says when you're going through hard times, it's actually a sign of God's love for you, not the opposite. It's actually a sign of his intimate involvement with you. He's changing you and shaping you and molding you. But I think the verses do bring a couple of questions to mind. You may say, when I hear the word discipline, I don't get excited. Yeah, certainly my experience. So what do we mean by discipline? Well, I don't think what we're talking about here is necessarily punishment. I don't think it's saying, I know that when I'm going through difficult times, I've often viewed it as, well, maybe God is punishing me for my sins. But I think that's a false sense of guilt. That's not what's going on. That's not what's going on in here. Punishment is when something is done, you've done something wrong, and therefore there's a consequences. I didn't go to a very good school at all, and we were in a form, our class, all the time, except for language classes when we mixed in with other kind of forms and other classes. When we were mixed in, there was always a competition to see who was the naughtiest. So German, for me, it was there was a competition to see which class could get the most detentions. And I remember once being in class and I was trying to get detention. My friends said, you haven't got a detention, you need to get one. So we stay ahead. And I'm like, I'm trying everything, please. And I just picked up my pencil case. I just threw it at my teacher. It hit her. She said, who did that? I said, me. Detention. Yes, result. Okay. That's punishment. I did something wrong. I got a punishment. Did I go to detention? Of course I didn't. But that is how punishment is meant to work. God doesn't punish us. Well, a lot of God's shaping and what's in view here is not God punishing in this sense. It's far, far more positive than that. It's about shaping, it's about teaching, it's about training. So I look at it like this. If you had a young sports team and you had a couple of players who were really good, you would actually invest the most in them because you see their potential to be stars of the future. That's where you'd invest. Because you really believe in them. So that might mean that you critique them a little bit harder than some of the other players. Some of the other players, they're just making up the numbers. You don't have high expectations. But these guys, you might drill them a little bit more. You might keep them on and keep them running a little bit further. You might push them, but it's because you see the potential in it. And I see God much more like that. He's a coach who's invested and interested in us. Therefore, he gives us focus and energy. But that looks like sometimes challenging shaping for us. So we're to endure hardship as discipline. But then the next question to ask is, I think, well, is everything hard in my life from God? Does all suffering come from God? And that's a big question. And I want to try and answer it by saying three things that I believe the Bible teaches as true. The first is that God is sovereign over all things. What I mean by that is God is absolutely in control of everything that ever happens. So, for example, Hebrews 1:3 says he sustains all things by his powerful word. At the moment, he's keeping everything going. He's keeping gravity going. He's keeping time ticking on. He's totally in control. Matthew 10:29-30 says, are not two sparrows sold for a penny, i.e. they're not very expensive or important, you could say. Yet none of them will fall to the ground outside of your Father's care. And he goes on to say, even the hairs on your head are numbered. He's saying, hey, even this insignificant thing, it will never fall to the ground outside of God's knowledge, outside of God's care. Even in the greatest detail, he's in control of everything. So we must believe that everything that's happening in your life, even if it's hard, is somehow under the control of God. The scary thing about that is, well, if this is happening to me, why is God allowing it to happen? It's a great question. I think what is a scarier thought is that what's happening to you is currently outside of the control of God. So if something really difficult is happening in your life and God's not in control of it, then who is in control of it? It means you can't go to God and pray about it because it's over his pay grade, if you like. He can't intervene. He can't change that circumstances. That means essentially the enemy is in control and his power is greater than God's. That is a far, far, far scarier concept. So even though it's difficult for us to handle, we've got to believe that God is in control of all things at all times and all moments. That's the first truth. The second truth is that God never initiates or creates evil. And just because he's in control doesn't mean that he brings about evil. James kind of tackles this in James chapter 1, verse 13. When he said, when you face difficult times, don't ever say, God is tempting me, because God would never tempt you. It's not God who's tempting you. God's not responsible for this evil that's going on in your life. And just like with the Hebrews, the persecution that they're facing, God didn't bring that persecution about on them. It was the evil that was in the emperors at the time. God was never responsible for it. He wasn't the initiator. For us, we live in a fallen world where, it's just messed up. And as Christians, we're not immune from experiencing the consequences of that mess. So difficult things will happen to us. But it doesn't mean that God is the initiator of those evil things. But the third thing that is true is that God always uses the difficult things for good. Even the hardest things he uses for good. I think the best illustration of that is the story of Joseph. He had many brothers and God had spoken to him about great things, but his brothers got jealous and they kind of threw him in a hole to end his life. Then they decided, well, we can make some money off this. So they pull him out. They sold him into slavery. He was a slave for many, many years. He was doing really well, and all of a sudden, he was falsely accused. Then he was thrown in prison for many, many, many years. And then all of a sudden, God turned it around, and he became the number 2 to the most important man in the world. But he had many, many years of hardship and suffering. And there's this verse in Genesis 50:20 that says, you intended it for harm, but God intended it for good. The truth is that every difficult thing that Joseph ever went for, God used it to shape him and to mold him, and God brought huge good out of it. And I say the other example of that is the death and resurrection of Jesus. The enemy, he thinks that he's winning. He's crucifying God. It's just like, well, it seems like the enemy is winning here, but God turns it around and he uses it for incredible good. And actually, in the moment of the greatest loss was actually the moment of the greatest victory. And we've got to hold on to that in our lives. Even the hard stuff, the difficult stuff, actually, God will use it for good. So he's always in control. Doesn't mean he initiates evil, but he will always use it for good. So we've got to endure hardship as if it's discipline. Use it as a growth opportunity. And we've got to believe that actually it's a sign of his love. And verse 11 is key. It's a verse I pray maybe almost every day. It says, no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. It's hard. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who've been trained by it. And there's the idea that it produces a harvest. And I think that harvest is disproportionate to what we actually go through. So maybe there is hardship that we endure, but God brings fruit from it. I don't know a lot about harvesting. Last year, I planted 5 or 6 cucumber seeds. And from that, I grew 2 cucumbers, as in plants, and they produced about 20 cucumbers each. So from 5 or 6 seeds, I got 40 cucumbers. That's a reasonable harvest. But when you think about it like this, each of those cucumbers has over 100 seeds. So I've gone from having 5 or 6 seeds to, in one crop, I've now got like 40,000 seeds at least. It's disproportionate to what I originally invested. I've got so more out of it than I ever expected. And I think we've got to take solace from that. The difficulties and the challenges that we go through, that God will use it for good, disproportionately to what we go through. Like he will really produce a harvest of righteousness. And I know like this is like the theory, and I'm presenting, and it like sounds really good, doesn't it? Until like you actually go through something that's really, really hard and the rubber hits the road. I was speaking to someone this week, and they just lost their mother, and she died peacefully. But he said the last few hours are really, really painful. And he said, to be honest, I find it very difficult to imagine how God could be real if someone could go through something like that. You know, I just don't believe that if there's a loving God out there, he would ever let that happen. He said there's certainly more, there's people who should be much further ahead in that queue to experience that than my own mother. And, you know, at that point in time, you don't try and give him this theology as a frame of reference. You just try and listen. But in my head, I was thinking, that question is still kind of there for me. How could God use something like that for good? The truth is, I believe that what he was experiencing was a result of a fallen world. It was never God's intention that we should die like that. We should experience pain like that. But that's a result of the world that we live in. It doesn't mean that he doesn't care immensely about the journey that we're going on. It doesn't mean that he's not so interested in us. And it doesn't mean that actually, in the scheme of things, he's not going to use it to good. And my prayer for this guy is actually that, that journey has been a provocation for him to think about his position and his faith. And maybe it could be part of God's journey into opening up his eyes. I don't know, that God could use it for good. So I don't want to, fall back on pithy sayings here, because when the rubber hits the road, it really is hard to deal with some of the stuff that's going on. But we got to believe that God does use it for good. And then the last few verses 12 to 17. It says, "Therefore strengthen your feeble arms and weak knees, make level paths for your feet so that the lame may not be disabled, but rather healed. Make every effort to live in peace with everyone, to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. See that no one is sexually immoral or godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the eldest son. Afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected, even though he sought the blessing with tears. He could not change what he had done." Kind of just going to focus in on Esau there. And I found these stats, and for the fact checkers out there, this was in the 2012 Daily Mail. It said a study of over 2,000 drivers found that 60% of men admitted to being distracted by attractive women while driving, and 12% of female drivers said that they took their eyes off the road to leer at a handsome man. I don't know if you're in that percentage or not. Figures show that distracted motorists in the UK caused an average of 2,525 crashes every day. That's huge, right? Every day. An equivalent of 921,000 per year. And researchers found that drivers tend to crash their cars into lampposts, or they shunt other vehicles, it's like minor crashes. And this happens more frequently in the summer when men and women are wearing less clothing. And I didn't really need to share that with you. There's a rough link, okay? It's like you're supposed to have your eyes on the road, but you see this thing and then you've hit the car in front of you, right? That's exactly what Esau did, right? He had this inheritance and he had this blessing, but he came back from like being away for a few days. His brother was cooking this delicious meal, a stew, and he said, I'll give you everything I stand to inherit in the future if you will give me this stew right now. And his brother's, well, done, deal, okay? They made that trade. It's a no-brainer. It's like so silly when you put it like that. It's like you've got your eyes on something bigger, supposed to be the road in this illustration, but you see something else and you get distracted. And it's actually quite challenging for us, actually, because we've been given like a race to run. We've been given like something to inherit. God has called us to things, but we so easily kind of get distracted. And actually, in verse 12, it said, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin which so easily entangles. And I think there's two kind of dynamics there. There's stuff that's not necessarily bad, it just hinders us. and then there's stuff that is overtly bad that we should definitely avoid. And I think, many of us are pretty good at trying to actively avoid the stuff that's bad for us, but the challenge is getting rid of all the stuff in the middle that's not really bad, but it's not really good, and it doesn't really help us on our journey. It's like the black and white. Some things are black, this is definitely wrong. Some things are white, this is definitely good. But there's a whole lot of stuff in the middle, like what we watch on TV, what we spend our money on, what we do with our time. It's just like actually that actually hinders us. And it's like if you're running a race, you want to carry like as little extra weight as possible, right? You don't want to run with things that you don't need. If I was going to run a marathon, I would never do it dressed as a rhino, right? I just don't need that extra weight. I'm just going to struggle to make it round. And it's like in our kind of race with God, actually, it's the same thing. We want to you want to get rid of everything that's going to hinder, everything that's unnecessarily going to weigh you down. Otherwise, you're kind of like Esau, where you're just like exchanging like eternal glory for just like a little kind of veering off to the side, for something that's like a momentary pleasure. And it's just not worth it. And I think there's a challenge in us to kind of think through, where are those things for us? Where are we compromising unnecessarily and actually doing an Esau and forfeiting the long-term goal for some short-term aim? And it kind of concluding, I just combine those words to closing. I just don't kind of want to miss the heart of God in this passage. I feel like what he was saying to the Hebrews and what he's saying to us now is like, there's not a moment in your life where God doesn't love you incredibly. That he is your Father, and even at the best bits, the most difficult bits, that it's hard to make sense of his love and understand what's going on, he absolutely loves you. And there isn't a second where his hand's not upon you, no matter what you go through, that he's not using and adjusting and shaping and bringing out the very best in you. And there was like words in worship around kind of chains being broken, And I think sometimes we have a picture of just a chain and it being cut and then we're running around all free. That does definitely happen, but sometimes in my own life, my experiences, those chains seem to be kind of so interrelated with who I actually am. The chains being cut away feels like a portion of me is being cut away at the same time. But actually once it's cut and it falls off, I realize it never was a part of me. That wasn't who I am. And even though it was painful and it hurt at times, actually God was always doing it to bring me into a greater sense of freedom. He's always doing it because he wants to bring me into a greater sense of joy. And whether it's like insecurities that are really hard to overcome and face up to, and it's painful to have to work through, actually, he cuts the chain and it hurts, but he releases me into a new security. He releases me into his love. And there's addictions that are like, you can feel so trapped and so caught in and so impossible. And overcoming it, you would love someone to come and get a chain and it's done. But it's not like that. It's like moment by moment, day by day. He kind of hacks it away until it's gone and it's done. God's love for us is always there and it's always present. And if you're in the 25% that's having a great time, then just feel free to go and experience and enjoy the love of God. If you're in the 50%, you won't always be there. You'll be, hope you go up rather than down, but And if you're in the 25%, well, as difficult it may seem, you've got to believe that God is in control. He is totally in control of that circumstances, and he's never going to push you beyond what you can handle. He's never going to push you over the edge, but he's going to use it for your good and for his glory. And